Why officers keep letting the silence sit. Imagine you're sitting in a small windowless room. The air is stale. The clock on the wall ticks louder than it should. Across from you, a police officer just asked a question you don't want to answer. You expect them to push harder. You expect them to raise their voice, to lean in, to try and break you. But instead, they just lean back, they cross their arms, and they say nothing. That's when the real pressure starts. Almost nobody talks about this part of an interrogation. Most people think officers use non-stop questions, good cop, bad cop routines, or raised voices to get a confession. But some of the most effective interrogators in the country use a completely different weapon: silence, and not just a few seconds of it. We're talking about minutes that feel like hours. They let the quiet sit in the room like a third person. And here's the unsettling truth: it works. It works incredibly well. But why? Why would a trained law enforcement officer choose to sit in total silence instead of pressing for answers? And more importantly, what does that silence actually do to the human brain on the other side of the table? By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why silence is one of the most psychologically powerful tools in any interrogation room. You'll learn the science behind why our brains panic when conversations stop. And you'll see why officers are trained to weaponize that discomfort. But first, we need to talk about the moment when everything changes. The moment when the officer stops talking and the suspect starts to realize that the silence isn't empty at all. It's full of pressure. Let's go back to that room. You've been asked a question. Let's say it's about where you were on a specific night. You give an answer. Maybe it's truthful, maybe it's not. Either way, the officer doesn't respond. They don't nod. They don't accuse. They don't ask a follow-up. They just wait. They might look down at their notes. They might hold eye contact with a neutral expression, but they will not speak. And that's when your brain starts doing something fascinating and terrifying. Here's what happens inside your head. Humans are social creatures. We are wired for conversation. We expect a back-and-forth rhythm. When someone asks you a question, you answer. And then you expect them to react. That reaction can be anything. A nod, a follow-up question, even a skeptical look. But when you get nothing at all, your brain registers that as a problem, a serious problem. Your amygdala, the part of your brain that processes threats, lights up. You start to feel a low-grade panic. Why aren't they saying anything? Did I say something wrong? Do they know I'm lying? Do they already have evidence I don't know about? This isn't just nervousness. It's a cognitive and emotional hijacking. Psychologists call this the response expectation gap. Your brain predicted a response. When that response doesn't come, you experience a kind of mental vertigo. And in that disorientation, you start to fill the void. You start to talk, not because you want to, but because the silence has become unbearable. This technique has a formal name in law enforcement training. It's called the silent treatment method. And it's a core component of the Reid technique, one of the most widely used interrogation methods in the United States. Officers are trained to ask a question, listen to the answer, and then pause. Not for 2 seconds, not for 5. For as long as it takes, sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes a full minute. In extreme cases, even longer. And here's the part that most people don't realize. That silence does something else too. It shifts the balance of power. When an officer is asking questions rapidly, they're doing all the work. They're driving the conversation. But when they go silent, they force the suspect to take control. And most people are not prepared for that. They don't know what to do with the silence. So they do the only thing they can think of. They fill it, they add details, they change their story, they offer explanations nobody asked for, and every single word they say is evidence. Let me give you a real example. In the early 2000s, a man was brought in for questioning about a burglary. He wasn't a suspect. He was just a person of interest. The officer asked him where he was the night of the crime. The man said he was at home watching television. Normal answer. Reasonable answer. Most people would stop there, but the officer didn't respond. He just sat there, silent. After about 20 seconds, the man started talking again. He said, I might have gone out to get food. I don't remember exactly. Another 10 seconds of silence. Then he said, look, I was at a friend's house, but I left early. Another 15 seconds. Then he changed his story completely and eventually admitted he was at the scene. Not because he was guilty of the burglary, but because the silence made him feel like his first answer wasn't believable. He talked himself into a confession that later turned out to be false. That's right, false. Because here's the darker side of this technique. It doesn't just work on guilty people, it works on innocent people too. And that's where the controversy begins. Studies on interrogation and false confessions have shown that silence-based tactics are incredibly effective at producing statements, but they're also incredibly effective at producing false statements. A landmark study from Northwestern University School of Law found that nearly 30% of wrongful convictions involved a false confession, and in many of those cases, the interrogation involved extended periods of silence and psychological pressure. Innocent people under the weight of that quiet start to doubt their own memory. They start to think, maybe I did do something wrong, maybe I just don't remember it. And once they start talking, they dig themselves deeper and deeper into a hole they never should have been in. So why do officers keep using it? Because it works on enough people that it's become standard practice. And because it leaves no marks, no bruises, no shouting, no threats. It's clean, it's legal, and it's devastating. But let's go deeper. Because the silence isn't just about getting someone to talk. It's also about reading them. Experienced interrogators watch everything while they're silent. They watch micro-expressions. They watch body language. They watch eye movement. The silence gives them a clean window into the suspect's psychological state. Someone who is telling the truth will often sit in the silence with a look of confusion or impatience. They might ask, "Are you going to say something?" Someone who is lying will often start fidgeting, sweating, or offering unsolicited details. The silence acts like a truth serum without any chemicals. It exposes the cracks in a story that words alone might hide. And here's something even more fascinating. Officers are also trained to use silence as a way to build rapport. Now that sounds contradictory, right? Silence to build connection. But think about it. When you're in a normal conversation, silence is awkward. But in an interrogation, if the officer sits silently and lets the suspect collect their thoughts, it can create a strange kind of intimacy. It signals patience. It signals that the officer isn't in a rush. And sometimes, that patience tricks the suspect into thinking the officer is on their side. That's when the walls really start to come down. There's a famous interrogation video from the 1990s. A murder suspect had been denying involvement for hours. The detective asked a question. The suspect gave his usual denial, and then the detective just stopped. He leaned back, looked at the ceiling, and said nothing. For nearly 2 minutes. The suspect stared at him, looked at the door, looked at his own hands. And then, in a quiet voice, he said, "What if I told you I was there, but I didn't do it?" That was the breakthrough. That silence broke him faster than any accusation ever could. But here's where it gets even more interesting. This technique isn't just used in interrogation rooms. It's used in courtrooms, depositions, and even business negotiations. Lawyers are trained to ask a question and then shut up, because the next person to speak often loses. In a deposition, if a lawyer asks a difficult question and the witness gives a weak answer, the lawyer will just sit there silently. The witness, uncomfortable with the silence, will start rambling. And that rambling often produces admissions or contradictions that can destroy a case. Same principle, different room. So if silence is this powerful, why doesn't everyone know about it? Why isn't this common knowledge? Because law enforcement doesn't advertise their tactics. And because most people have never sat in an interrogation room. They've only seen interrogations on TV shows and movies. And in Hollywood, interrogations are loud. They're aggressive. The good cop, bad cop routine is dramatic. But real interrogations are often quiet, boring even, until they're not. And that's exactly why the silence works. People walk in expecting an argument. Instead, they get patience. They get stillness. And that stillness is far more unnerving than any raised voice. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a conversation where someone just stopped talking? A friend? A partner? A boss? And you felt that sudden pressure to fill the gap? That same instinct that makes you say, "Well, anyway," or "So what I meant was," that's the exact same psychological mechanism. Now multiply that by 100, because in an interrogation room, the stakes aren't social embarrassment. The stakes are your freedom. Officers know this. They've been trained in it, and they use it every single day. But there are limits. The Supreme Court has ruled on interrogation tactics many times, and while silence itself is not coercive in a legal sense, it can become problematic when combined with other factors. Lengthy isolation, deprivation of food or sleep, implied promises of leniency. Those things can cross the line into coercion, but silence alone, completely legal, completely allowed, and completely effective. One of the most famous examples of silence as a weapon comes from the case of the Central Park Five. In 1989, 5 teenagers were wrongfully convicted of assaulting a jogger in New York City. Their confessions were later proven false, but those confessions didn't come from physical torture. They came from hours of psychological pressure, including long periods where detectives simply sat in silence, waiting for scared, exhausted children to say anything that would end the interrogation. And they did. They said what the officers wanted to hear, not because it was true, but because the silence was unbearable. That case changed how many people think about interrogation tactics. But the use of silence never went away. It's still taught, it's still practiced, and it's still producing both real confessions and tragic mistakes. So what should you take away from this? First, silence is a tool, a powerful one, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for harm. In the hands of a skilled, ethical interrogator, silence can help uncover the truth. It can give someone the space to admit something they've been hiding out of shame or fear. In the hands of someone overzealous or biased, silence can help manufacture a confession from an innocent person who just wanted to go home. Second, your brain is not as strong as you think it is. Under pressure, even smart, honest people can talk themselves into trouble. That's not a character flaw, it's human nature. And it's exactly what officers are counting on. And third, if you ever find yourself in an interrogation room and you've watched this video, you already know more than most people. You know that silence isn't empty, it's a tactic, it's a weapon, and you have the right to remain silent too. Real silence. Not the silence they force on you, the silence you choose. Have you ever been in a situation where an awkward silence made you say something you regretted? Think about it, because the officers already have. If you want to understand more about your rights during an interrogation or how psychological tactics are used in the legal system, hit that subscribe button. We break down cases and techniques like this every week. And drop a comment below. Have you ever experienced the power of silence in a high-stakes conversation? Let us know. Because the quietest moment in the room is never really quiet. It's the loudest weapon they have. And now you know exactly why they keep letting it sit.